Why did the auditor bring a magnifying glass to the audit?
Oh, I could say a lot of things, but I'm not sure why.
To zoom in on the details, kind of like our next presenter. Ben Snyman is the CEO and co-founder of AuditSoft, the industry leader in digital audit and compliance solutions. He is a qualified attorney and MBA holder with over 30 years of expertise in legal, operational, and regulatory risk management. A recognized authority in contractor pre-qualification and OH&S compliance. A frequent speaker and thought leader in OH&S regulations, risk management, and compliance technology. Partnered with associations across Canada, AuditSoft provides powerful tools that deliver trusted data to help organize and mitigate risk. Today, over 6,500 core audits are conducted annually using AuditSoft.
Collin Pullar returns to lead this armchair discussion with Ben. Collin is the president of the SCSA and looking quite dapper, sir, and held previous roles in labor market development and technology management. He is an MBA holder, a Canadian human resource professional, and currently completing postgraduate studies for a Master of Law degree. Over to you, Collin.
Okay. Thanks, Ben and Sue. And Ben, I wore the tie for you especially, so
thank you. I don't own one, so I unfortunately.
No, that's great. Ben, I'm so glad we're going to have this conversation here. For those who are watching and listening, the core program is such a fundamental piece of our organization and something that the entire industry relies on. So this conversation around the importance of audits, the values of it, some of the philosophies that you want to talk about today, I think are going to be really valuable to those listening today. So, Ben, where do you want to start with this conversation?
Collin, wherever you want to start, you can ask any questions. I mean, I would like to start by just congratulating you and your team on an absolute wonderful conference that you put together. I've kind of gone in and out of it, and I just thought that everything, like the lawyer was fantastic. That's one of the best detailed presentations that I've seen. Threads of Life is something that we support heavily, and then health and safety. Mental health and safety. I mean, I think these things I think you put a very good roster together, and I'm very appreciative for being invited. I think where I would like to start maybe is just to talk about core in principle. We've been supporting core in different ways over the last 20 years, and I think that maybe I'll just start here and say that as Canadians, we are so reluctant to pat ourselves on the back on a job well done, and the certificate of recognition, if you look at the way that it's done, right, is it, people would like to refer to ISO as the leading standard. But if you look at the application of how core has been applied, how it follows ISO 19011 guidelines, and how it not only looks at health and safety management from a micro perspective, but from a macro industry perspective, I think that organizations like yourself need to really pat yourself on the back not just because of the methodology, but also of the quality of the audits. Because it's very different to anything else out there, because it has a very strong qualitative component where we rely significantly on the expertise of auditors. And then there's also a quantitative component where we kind of weight certain questions based on risk. And I think that's very helpful to drive continuous improvement. So based on the number in construction, I think it's 10,700 in Canada. If you look at it per capita, we're probably the leading program in the world. And I would not be surprised if we outrank OSHA's 18,001 and 45,001. So maybe I'll just start there, just saying, we support this because we really believe in the certificate of recognition.
Ben, we talked about particularly this, at this time where we've got this kind of this political environment and around Canadian-made products. I mean, one of the things that we've been communicating or trying to communicate with people is the power of this core program, and that it's a Canadian-made, industry-specific tool, and that's unique. I don't know if you could you comment on that, because you've seen programs from around the world, and you've said that this is very unique in just the way that it's made for this particular population.
Yeah, I think that so I've looked at I've there's quite a few programs all around the world: Australia, New Zealand, the UK. The UK is pretty strong, but they follow ISO very strongly. And then the United States have the VPP, the Voluntary Protection, OSHA's Voluntary Protection Program. So the Voluntary Protection Program, to give you an idea, out of about 300 million plus people in the United States, they've only got 2,000 companies in the VPP program, right? And not a lot in ISO. Funny enough, the leader by far, probably by double the rest of the world, is China. So it kind of, so in ISO 45001. But I think that what is interesting, if you look at ISO and even VPP, is they've created a standard, but the standard is agnostic to jurisdiction and to industry, just because of the very nature of it. So they've put a lot of reliance on the auditor to define the question set. And because they put a lot of on the auditor, every audit is slightly different. So you can't really compare the one audit to another audit. Because if you and I go and audit against a standard, we're just going to come up with different question sets. They'll be similar, but the way we look at evidence is going to, how we're going to gather evidence is going to differ, right? You might do a number of interviews. I might not even do interviews in certain cases, and
Okay.
You are allowed to do that in ISO. They're not that prescriptive. But so if you want to take an audit and you want to make it stronger, right? What would you do? You would kind of say, okay, well, how can we create a question set that not only helps organizations drive health and safety and continuous improvement, but how can we do it so that we can do it for a specific industry, for a specific jurisdiction, and then how can we together learn where the potential gaps are, right? How can we improve the industry as a whole, and how can we support it? So how can we support it through training? How can we support it through awareness? How can we support it through this kind of conferences like this, right? These are all things that are very specific to not only construction, but construction in Saskatchewan. So that's how the core differs. I mean, core is not run out of the UK. It's run right there. You're driving it right there in Saskatchewan. So it's very hands-on. And I think that's what core provides. It's not an invented somewhere else solution. It's invented and applied in Saskatchewan, and the auditors understand what the auditees are going through, and I think that makes it so powerful. And then, go ahead.
No, it was really on that there's decades of work done around this program. And
yes,
the fact that you've been able to build up monstrous amounts of data because of that consistent format of the application in here is something that I've heard you talk about before. Could you maybe speak a bit more about that for the audience?
Yeah, you know what? If I don't know if Emery can bring up, there's a slide 10, right? That if you can, if he doesn't mind bringing up that slide. So the big problem that we have with most other audits, let's call it standards. So there's a whole bunch of standards out there. But like for example, ISO 45001 has a very clear standard, and it's got guidelines around auditing, right? It uses ISO 19011, but it doesn't provide you with a question set. So because it doesn't provide you with a question set, you can't, and it doesn't tell you how you use it. It's very difficult to capture the data. Now, what we've done with Saskatchewan, and because of the very nature of core, is because not only are the questions standardized, but also the way that evidence is gathered is standardized. It allows us to, it's only through standardization that you can gather data, right? So now, because of that, we have a quantitative and a qualitative component of data that we're capturing. And what we can do now through AuditSoft is we can take that data and we can aggregate it right down to a question level. And then we can start using that data and feed that data back to you to see where are the trends, where are organizations. So where is the organization at a micro level moving? How are they improving? Are they maybe neglecting certain elements? So we've got now, because of that data, we can track year-to-year data. We can track data at a industry level, so industry code level, if you will. We can track and aggregate data at a holistic, at a macro level, at a provincial level, and that data, right, which doesn't exist in ISO, right, that data can drive very intelligent decision making that can drive policy. So I mean, it's going to give you, Collin, in some time, it's already starting to do that. It's going to give you the data to say, listen, maybe government should invest more in this kind of training. Maybe it should invest more in psychological health and safety. And then what we can take is we can take this data, which is leading indicator data, and we can start marrying it to lagging indicators. And then in that way, it becomes really, really, really powerful. And because of the data points and because of the way that it links to evidence and qualified accredited auditors, this data is very, very defensible, right? So because, you can go back and you can say, okay, how did they come to this conclusion? And all of that data and evidence is captured and aggregated. So, everyone talks about data. Data is great, right? But the thing about data is it's only the beginning point, right? I always like to tell people that data interpreted is information. Information applied is knowledge, and knowledge applied correctly is wisdom. So we're capturing this data, but we have to take this data to use it to save lives, save people's lives. That is what is important. If we don't do that and we don't improve people's lives on a health, safety, and psychological level, then what are we doing? But I think that's what data should drive, is doing things right the first time so it doesn't impact people. And that's what our focus is at AuditSoft, where we say reliable data saves lives.
Well, to that point, I mean, that's an audit philosophy that you've shared. I've heard you say that a few times, and you've kind of built that around the concept of giving key stakeholders assurance of good governance, and one of the foundational pillars of good governance in an organization. But you literally have a global perspective. I mean, your accent suggests that you're not from originally from Calgary.
To that point, I was born in Ontario, Kitchener-Waterloo, Ontario. I just want to make sure I'm just as Canadian, 1968, so I'm Canadian. I grew up in South Africa, yes.
Okay. Could you talk about that element of assurance for stakeholders, or the elements of governance that you think are really critical to understand? Is that there's this particular role that we're doing through this audit process that should give people assurance, and you've spoken about that before. Could you speak to it again?
You know what? I think that the one thing that I'd like everyone to know on this call is that let everyone's talking about ESG, environment, social, and governance, right? But I mean, I think it's so important that people understand that, and especially post-COVID, that health and safety is at the center of that. If your people do not feel healthy, safe, protected, and cared for, everything else falls on the wayside, right? So I kind of wanted to say that as the first thing. This whole ESG thing starts with us as health and safety in the health and safety profession, right? And they include well-being, mental health into that, right? And what stakeholders or what people that have a vested interest in an organization want these days, right? So let's say we know that core is used for contractor pre-qualification. Why? We would, what do employees want to know, right? What value could core hold for them? What does insurance companies want to know? What does the community want to know? Well, they all want to know that you're governing your organization in such a way that is promoting health and safety and the well-being of your workers and people that come onto your work sites. That's what people want to know. Now, how do they know that? What is the best way to know? How do we test ourselves? We test ourselves usually through an external exam. For some, you're doing your master's right now, so how do I know what you're doing, that, is valid? Like, and the way that we do that in the health and safety world is through an audit, right? So if I want to know how I'm doing, you can do it as a gap analysis in the beginning to see what your gaps are. You can do it after you think you've implemented it successfully. I think that you can use that. You as an organization use it at the end, right? For certification. So if you have a set of questions, right, you can now and you measure yourself against this industry recognized standard core. You can now say that I've not only implemented a health and safety program, but I have done my due diligence because I've tested it against an industry recognized standard. Okay, so now the second question is going to be, thank you, because I might just forget these. So the second question might be then, so the first one is I have to test it. I have to test it against the standard. And the second one, it's got to be industry recognized standard, right? And thirdly, you'd want somebody independent to come and audit it, right? So you have independent auditors that go and audit. Yes, we have internal audits or maintenance audits, and these are part of the Plan, Do, Check, Act process. But it's that third party, that independent audit, that adds another level of credibility and assurance to your audit, right? And then the next thing is, you have to say, okay, well, how is the audit performed? Can I say that the auditors are looking at the appropriate evidence? Because what you want to do is you don't want an opinion-based audit. You want an evidence-based audit. And you want that audit to be reliable, right? So what does that mean? It means that the evidence that you're looking at to define whether the criteria is met or not, it needs to be verifiable, it needs to be relevant, and it needs to be sufficient. And all those things core does. We set that standard. We say that, you can't just go and interview one person, or we've heard this and then usually these are the most advanced and experienced auditors. They're like, I don't need to do audit interviews. I can just walk the shop floor and I can see what's going on. I don't have to talk to people. Well, then that individual just turned that audit from an evidence-based audit into an opinion-based audit. And that is the power of core. It's not an opinion-based, it's an evidence-based audit. And that carries a high level of credibility and defensibility in the world of assurance. And that very same reason is why we see in certain provinces, the insurance company saying, hey, you provide us this insurance that you're mitigating your risk, we're going to provide you a financial rebate or incentive.
Yeah, all this is really about this concept of building confidence, whether it be confidence in the buyer, confidence with the public, confidence of employees. And I have this little formula. You probably heard me talk about it. That confidence equals competence multiplied by character, and those three factors. When you start, you've got low competence, high character. That's great. You got a wonderful person, but you can't have confidence because you can't necessarily see that somebody's got the tools and the experience to do this right. this whole competency and character element is really critical to the core process, and to build the confidence. And you've talked about the competence of auditors being critically important, regardless of what field that they're in, whether it's in safety or finance or wherever, or in the areas that you've had to work in terms of previous law practice. Could you speak to that element as well, because that's something that you felt was really important to speak about earlier?
You're talking about the auditors specifically.
Yeah.
You know what? I've got a slide. Maybe if you can pull up slide 7, right? What CORE does, and what we do with associations like yourself that is really serious about doing it, not only doing performing audits, but actually doing it right, is that we try and align the audits with 19,011, right? And 19,011 is a guideline for doing management system audits like a core audit. And it's based on 7 auditing principles. It used to be 6, and now they've turned it into 7. And maybe what I'll do is I'll talk about that, because competence for audit, it goes right through. It's not just about the auditor's competence. The audit is actually auditing the competence of the organization in the implementation of an audit. But why I say that core and the way that we've done it here in Canada is just so superior is because the first 5 elements of a successful core is about the auditor. And that is kind of where your organization comes in, Collin. So you're looking at the integrity of the auditor when you look at their background and when you employ them. And we see this across Canada, that integrity of the auditor plays a big role. You look at fair presentation. So in other words, like, is this person able to come in objectively, and do they understand that business, which is construction, right? You have what do you call it? A code of ethics, right? And there is a way that audits are done. So you want to make sure that when you interview people and somebody says something to the auditor about, like, this is not happening in the organization, you don't want that person to say, oh, Collin said this is. And you don't want you want to make sure that you do it in a way where you are measuring the process and not the person, and that you protect the person. And then also in some cases the auditor has the right to stop work if they see something that's unsafe. There's a big confidentiality, and then obviously you're not supposed to audit your own work, so independence. So those 5 first 5 elements is all about the competence and the expertise and the knowledge and the skills of the auditor. And based on what I've seen working with you guys have implemented all of that, right? Then only the 6 is then about, okay, prescribing and looking at, okay, how is evidence captured, right? And then finally the risk-based approach, right, which is the final one that they added in 2018. Now that risk-based approach is also like, so what we do is we weight it, we ask the questions, and we weight them based on risk. So a question that is about implementation would carry more weight than a directive question. But that can only be done, that risk-based approach of identifying areas for improvement and providing qualitative comments can only be done by a competent auditor. So this whole thing, I recently actually did a LinkedIn post saying we can package the tools, we can provide you all the tools with the efficiency, but we can never package the auditor. Yes, artificial intelligence, people are talking about artificial intelligence, but artificial intelligence is never going to replace the auditor. You're going to have eyes on the business, and you're going to have that expertise. And it's going to be very difficult. So competency plays a massive role, and that, unfortunately or fortunately, Collin, falls on your shoulders to make sure that you've got competent auditors, because without competent auditors, the audit loses all its value.
Yeah, I particularly appreciate when you're talking about the evidence reviewing the evidence, and whether that be through, sometimes somebody completely says, hey, like, we don't need to interview somebody, or I don't necessarily need to look at that document. But it's important to have evidence prove that, yes, we've done something that is, and you talk about being defensible, because when things do go wrong in companies, right? So you can put all the things in place and take all the safety measures, and things still go wrong. And oftentimes people come back and say, well, what happened in that core audit? And what evidence did we have to say that, yes, this particular company met the standard to achieve and to receive that core certification? Are there situations that you've dealt with where that has been say a factor in whether an audit, whether it be a core audit or any other system, that's become an issue either from a litigation perspective or really kind of any other experience?
I've not seen it from a litigation perspective, and I will say that an audit in itself, I have seen cases where an audit does play a role in the organization and showing that it has a culture of safety, and that it allows itself to go through third-party independent audits, right? I think that I have never seen it like, how would I say it? So let me kind of take a step back. So firstly, we have to remember that an audit is only a snapshot in time, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And then the second thing we have to remember is that we only work with, I personally, AuditSoft only works with organizations that are, or mostly works with organizations that are prescriptive in the way that evidence is gathered, right? So in other words, in using our software, if you do not follow the process, your audit will be incomplete. You would not be following the process appropriately. So I can't speak to actual cases, but I can say that in terms of the ISO, well, let me kind of say two things, right? It's ISO 19011 requires you to gather evidence. It's not prescriptive, right? And so it talks about reliability of the audits, of the evidence. So I'll give you an example, right? So let's say, do you have a health and safety policy, right? So if you have now how do I make sure that you have a health and safety policy? In ISO, I can go to a company, I can say, show me your health and safety policy. I look at the health and safety policy and I say, they have a health and safety policy and it conforms, right? In a audit that you perform, you're going to say, show me your health and safety policy, and okay, it exists, but I also want to check that it's signed. I want to see that it's dated. I want to see that it talks about worker involvement. It talks about management, leadership commitment, etc. Right? So the one is prescriptive. You have to look at these 5 things. The other one is non-prescriptive. It says it doesn't tell you what you need to do. So now, which one is more reliable? And now, so looking at the document and looking at the content, that makes it relevant and it makes it verifiable. But is that sufficient? No, it's not sufficient. Maybe you should talk to people. So now you talk to people and you say, hey, do you know where to find the health and safety policy? Have you read the health and safety policy? Now, if they say, no, I've never seen it, I don't even know where to find it. Now you have to ask, like, okay, do you have a health and safety policy? Is having a piece of document enough, right? So now you can say, well, okay, so I've looked at the document. I've asked people, the majority of them say they know where to find it. I feel confident that but maybe there's an observation, right? Let's go and see if it's posted on their website. Let's go see if it's posted on the wall in their lobbies or in their, wherever. So because core is very prescriptive and defines what evidence needs to look at, right? You have to say that that methodology is much more credible than one where it's non-prescriptive, because you don't necessarily know what the other auditor looked at. And because it's so explicit and prescriptive, right? If I look at, do you have a health and safety policy in place, right? Using Saskatchewan's core, right? And you do it, because it's so prescriptive, we're going to come to very similar conclusions. And that also makes the core very much more powerful, because no other audit protocol can provide industry with that kind of level of inter-auditor consistency. And that is even more powerful on data, in terms of the data, because of that methodology being followed, we can now say this company, and we can compare two companies, especially when we do contractor pre-qualification, right? And so what I can say though is that when we look at ISO audits, and I don't want to put, I'm going to get into trouble for putting ISO, I don't want to put ISO audits down, but it's very difficult to compare one ISO audit to another ISO audit, because you don't know necessarily what questions were asked and what evidence was gathered and what methodology was used.
Okay.
But just to go back to the legal question, I think that if you have an audit, you're always going to be better positioned than not having an audit.
Yeah, for sure. Before I go further with my questions here, if anyone from the crowd's got a question, please pop into the comment section. We're going to try to squeeze in a little bit of time to be able to pull some if we spot a couple that we think would be really good to pose here. Ben, maybe I could just make a comment at this juncture here. Everything that you've covered off so far. We talked about confidence for buyers of construction, or those who are procuring, construction services of the public. But I also read in this that the way that this audit's done can also give a lot of support to the company in terms of areas that they can improve, ways that they can manage their business perhaps differently, not just in safety, but how they manage their relationships with employees, their relationships with their suppliers, their customers that they serve. Is that, with that assumption, I'm going to say, I'll just throw it out there as an assumption. Do you see evidence of that from your experience working with so many companies across Canada that, this was actually support to them?
Oh, definitely. I mean, core, submitting yourself to a core, you're submitting yourself to a test, right? Okay. And there's a lot of organizations that don't see the value of this. But I think that, if I have to, I mean, we're seeing the contractor core being a pre-qualification requirement across the nation now. The evidence, right? The evidence, I don't know if you're familiar with some of the research done in BC. I think it's by UBC maybe. I mean, everything shows that organizations that have a strong health and safety program in place by far outperforms in terms of number of health and safety incidents those that do not have it, right? But the thing is, it goes further than that in my mind. And I come from the risk management. You've got an MBA. It goes much. What an incident, when an incident occurs, right? You can go back right down to near misses, right up to a fatality. You can look at that pyramid, right? Organizations that have very strong health and safety culture, the quality, their processes are much stronger, right? Because what are we doing? We're removing errors, right? We're removing errors. I've got a very good story where in Alberta here, somebody told me this story, and they said to qualify, they had to go and present the health and safety program. So the CEO presented the health and safety program. He said, "Here's my folder." And the guy said, "Well, tell me a little bit about your health and safety program." And this guy "Oh, I don't know anything. Well, I don't know what's in that folder. I have no clue what's in that folder." Right? And then they said, well, okay, sorry, we're not going to give you the job, right? Like, because we take health and safety very serious. So if you want, go back, go take this course, immerse yourself, and then come back and tell us about your health and safety program. So the guy went back, did that, said, okay, I'll do it. I don't want to be ever be in that embarrassing position again. And he presented this, and he was quite proud of his health and safety program, and they got the job. And then about a year later, his accountant came to him and he said, like, you know what? Your motor vehicle maintenance cost has gone down significantly. What did you guys do? So this has nothing to do with health and safety.
Yep.
He said, oh, we've done nothing. Like, what did we do? The only thing that he had, it was in the construction industry, had a whole bunch of young people working for him. And the only thing that he did is that he implemented a process is before you get in your vehicle, you have to walk around the vehicle, right? So what went down? They stopped hitting walls, they stopped hitting poles, they stopped hitting other cars. So obviously it was much safer because they didn't hit people as well. But like those are the things that we don't see directly about health and safety, is all those the efficiencies and the productivity. And we know that the stats show us that, but a lot of times, if he didn't have an accountant saying, what did you do? He wouldn't even know that his health and safety system cost him a whole bunch of money, saved him a whole bunch of money in maintenance. So yes, I think that a strong health and safety, it's like, it's like when you go to your teenager's room, right? It tells what that room looks like, tells you a lot about the kid and the parents, right?
100%. I don't know if I told you this, but I mean, articles that have written that strong safety systems are often a proxy for good management. It's a great measuring stick, and we've even seen organizations like CRA, as a matter of fact, at one point had made very public that watching what was happening in companies' safety performance was one of the triggers on whether or not they were going to audit a company from a financial perspective, from a tax perspective. So, again, that proxy, or that acting like a proxy, because of the fact that you become very methodical in the way that you're managing one element of your business, has all sorts of knock-on effects in a positive way for other parts of the organization. So thank you for that.
Definitely.
Can we pivot for a minute to the mindset, because we talked about the auditor, and we talked about AI, and we've had conversations around high degrees of automation and the technology, even the technology that AuditSoft brings. There's a shift that has to occur in terms of our awareness that our job as auditors is not just checking boxes. It doesn't matter if it's from a safety audit or from a financial audit. And I'm probably a little more familiar from the financial side. It's just checking the box to say, yeah, that's there, that's there, that's there. That's one element of it. But applying critical thinking, or I think you had said something about having a skeptical or more holistic view of an organization can bring far more value as an auditor. Can you talk about that again? Because you had the way that you phrased it to me before I think was pretty valuable.
Well, I think that it's like you mentioned something about character and confidence, right? And so I think that every auditor that's worth their salt would want to work, like, even if you have 100% audit, right? You would want to leave the auditee with something to improve. And we train and we work with probably about 500 plus auditors. If you look at internal auditors, probably more than that. But if you look at external auditors, the ones that are the most successful are the ones that are actually, their main objective is to go onto site and add value. So you can have 100% audit, but you can still say, look, you did everything in this, but be careful. Like you haven't looked at it for 2 years and 11 months. Maybe you want to have a look at that process again, or
right.
it's signed, but just remember your CEO, I hear he's going to go on retirement, so make sure your new, like, I don't know, there's always something that they can do. Now, it's like I say to my kids, and everyone's heard this, right? When they talk about artificial intelligence, within the last 2 years, artificial intelligence is really, it's every part of our life right now, right? And it's really getting better. Like, there was a time where I'm like, okay, this is just a big plagiarism tool. They're just taking this thoughts and putting it into here, but it is learning. It's so as you teach it, it's learning. But in auditing, I don't think it will. Number one, it can't do the interviews. It can't. The interviews component is, unless we go to standard surveys, the interview component is so important, I think. And I don't think AI is going to be able to do that. And AI is going to probably struggle moving around doing observations.
Sure.
Where we can use AI is we're starting to look at AI more as an assistant. So where it's, because a health and safety policy is a health and safety policy. So we can say, is there something that addresses leadership commitment? Does it do this? Is there a signature? Is it dated within the last 3 years, for example, right? And then what we can do, then the auditor can decide whether they wanted to do a deep dive. It's kind of like tax. They don't always look at all the receipts, right? But they do look at some of them. So the way we see artificial intelligence, like, it's so, like, as I said, like what I say to my kids, right? Artificial intelligence is not going to take your job. People that use artificial intelligence is going to take your job. So we have to use it to create efficiencies, right? But to what point? And in this case, it's the way that I want to look at it is artificial intelligence should be used so we can even increase the value that the auditor can provide, right? Because, I mean, like, a third-party auditor coming to your site, that's an opportunity.
Absolutely.
That's an opportunity to learn what other people are doing, to learn what you can do better, and it's gonna hit your bottom line. You're gonna be more productive. You're gonna be walking the talk. I think that artificial intelligence is here to stay. Like, ESG is here to stay, but it's not going to replace the people. It's going to make them more efficient and more effective, and hopefully we can get more people into the certificate of recognition.
100%. Well, listen, I've got one question. We're going to be able to respond to this really quick because I want to give a chance for you to wrap up. But Sandra had a question. Some industries is really large. They're large with multiple sites. Would you suggest that scoping the size of the audit is better to be by the facility or by service or unit line is preferred to align an audit simply to agreed scope that's built in collaboration with the employer? This gets into, how do we structure an individual audit? But if you've got a thought on that might offer a useful opinion for them.
Yeah, Sandra, that's a very good question. It's like it goes back to that sufficiency, right? How do you you've got a company of 20 people. It's kind of easy to do interviews, right? And you can get but if you've got a company of 2,000, right? Okay, now what is your scope? What how many people do I need to interview? And now it becomes a question of practicality, right? Unfortunately, because if I have to, let's say I'll just use a silly example. Let's say I have 20 people, I can interview 10 people. 2,000 people, I can't interview 1,000 people. It's cost prohibitive and time prohibitive. So that's kind of where, and I'm kind of sorry to throw it back to you, Collin, but that's kind of where the association needs to decide, okay, what is going to be acceptable within this environment. Now, I think it would always be better if you can do audits because now with AuditSoft, you can kind of roll these audits up, right? But I think that if you can do a small audit, right, it's always going to be much more valuable. But it's in a lot of these cases, unfortunately, it's about cost and time, right?
Yeah, and certainly the return on the sample size that you're selecting on it. And, you know, we have some things that we provide some guidance on that, and based on the size of organizations and the complexity and the number of sites that are happening, particularly with some of our larger construction companies as well. So, you know, that's certainly something that our team can help advise in terms of the context of what we see in Saskatchewan.
And to a certain degree, to Sandra's question is like, you know, like it also depends on the organization, the leadership. Some organizations might say, this is important enough for me, I want every site or every department or whatever to be audited. But unfortunately, you know, it becomes two things, right? Cost,
Yep.
You know, and a risk tolerance, right? You know, a company might say, yeah, I'm okay with this, you know, and unfortunately, you know, we can only advise, and that's what Colin's team does, and we only enable what Collin tells us to a certain degree. That's software. We're an enablement tool. The strategy and the methodology to a certain degree, to a large degree, lies with Collin and his team.
Yeah. Well, Ben, thank you so much for doing this. We're getting close to the top of the hour here, and we'll make sure people can get a chance to get their lunch. I appreciate this conversation and your insight, particularly because, again, you've got not just a national scope, but really a global scope with some of the experiences that you bring to this. So just really appreciate it so much. Do you have a final thought or anything that you'd like to share, Ben, before I hand things back off to Dallas and Sue?
Well, I mean, I just, you know, I just want to commend you guys that, you know, and I think that, you know, we like to criticize the government. We like to criticize ourselves sometimes. We're our own worst critic. But I think, like, you know, everyone that's involved in the certificate of recognition process, everyone that is doing auditing, implementing, I think, do not forget, it's a very unthankful job, right? It's not a hero job. It's like the person that puts a railing next to a river, right? That person that put in the railing will never know how many people they saved, right? But before the railing, somebody fell in and a fireman jumped in and saved one person, and that person was a hero. And we're kind of in the railing building. We're creating controls. We're doing things so that it never gets to that point where somebody needs to be saved. And I think that's noble. I think everyone involved that's doing something like this, especially now in mental health and with everything going on, you know, we as Canadians are really leading the world, and I don't even know if we know that we're doing that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again, Ben. Dallas and Sue, I think they're waiting in the wings here, and again, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this. I think it was a great discussion.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.